I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who'd end up with her life splintered into two pieces, the before and the after, divided by a single moment that I couldn't have seen coming if I'd been looking right at it. And the worst part, the part that keeps me up at night, is that I brought him into my home. I opened my door, and I let the whole thing walk right in. I'm 32 years old, and I live in a 2-bedroom apartment in a renovated brick building in the heart of the city, the kind of place with exposed ductwork and concrete floors that people pay way too much for because it's close to all the good bars and restaurants. I'd spent years building a life there, a stable, predictable life with my boyfriend of 6 years, Kyle. He was a project manager for a commercial construction company, which meant he wore those expensive work boots and drove a truck and was always covered in a fine layer of dust when he came home. He was solid, dependable, the kind of man who remembered to take out the trash and would make you breakfast on a Sunday morning without being asked. But the thing about a life that's too stable, too predictable, is that you start to take it for granted. You start to feel a little restless, a little bored, even if you don't want to admit it. I worked as a marketing consultant for a few small tech startups, managing social media accounts and crafting brand voices from a laptop at the kitchen island.
I had a lot of freedom in my schedule, maybe too much, because I filled the empty spaces in my day with daydreams, with questions about whether this was it, if this was the sum total of my life. That restlessness was probably why I didn't think twice when Liam needed a place to stay. Liam was my best friend, or at least he had been. We'd met in college in a creative writing class that was supposed to be an easy elective, but ended up being the only class I actually looked forward to. He was loud and funny and had this way of looking at you like you were the only person in the room. He was a filmmaker, or he wanted to be one, and he had this magnetic energy that made people want to be around him. We'd been inseparable for years after graduation, through awful jobs and worse apartments, through first dates and breakups, through all the messy, confusing years of our early 20s. But then he got a chance to work on a documentary out on the West Coast, and he was gone for a few years. The distance changed things, not in a bad way, but in the way that life just sort of pulls people in different directions. We still talked, texted, sent each other memes, but it wasn't the same. When he called to say he was coming back east, that the project had fallen through and he was basically broke and needed a place to land for a few weeks, I didn't even hesitate. I was honestly excited. A part of me that I hadn't realized was sleeping woke up at the thought of having him around again.
I told Kyle about it over dinner, a Tuesday night takeout situation on the couch. I was so eager, I talked over him a little, telling him all about Liam, about the old days, painting this picture of a brilliant, misunderstood artist who just needed a break. Kyle was quieter than usual, but he didn't say no. He said it was my place too, and if I thought it was a good idea, he trusted me. So Liam arrived on a rainy Thursday afternoon with 2 duffel bags and a guitar case, and a smile that was just as familiar as the day he left. He looked a little more worn around the edges, with some stubble and a weary look in his eyes, but he was still Liam. He came in and dropped his bags and just hugged me, this long, tight hug that smelled like rain and cheap cologne and something else, something nostalgic. The week that followed was a blur of old jokes and late nights. We stayed up watching terrible movies on the couch, drinking wine and talking about everything and nothing. He'd set up his laptop on the coffee table and show me rough cuts of his work, and I'd give him feedback, feeling that old creative spark ignite inside me. It was heady having him there. He brought chaos and energy into my carefully curated, orderly life. Kyle would come home from work and find us like that, in the middle of some laughter-fueled conversation, and he'd just give a little nod and go into the kitchen to heat up his dinner. At first, I thought he was just being respectful, giving us space to catch up. But after a few days, I noticed a shift. He stopped asking about Liam's projects. He started going to bed earlier and earlier, saying he was tired from a long day at the site. He'd kiss me on the forehead, not on the lips, and disappear into the bedroom, leaving me and Liam alone in the glow of the television. I didn't want to see it for what it was, because if I did, I'd have to admit that maybe I was preferring those late nights with Liam. It was a Saturday night when it happened. Kyle was out at a dinner with some old college friends, a reunion thing he'd been dreading but felt obligated to go to. I remember him lingering by the door, looking at me, and there was this strange, sad look in his eyes that I couldn't quite place. He asked if I was sure I didn't want to come, and I said I was tired, that Liam and I were just going to watch a movie and crash early.
He nodded, and I saw the disappointment flicker across his face, but I ignored it, the same way I'd been ignoring his subtle attempts to pull me back in all week. I was selfish, and I wanted the night to myself, or more accurately, I wanted a night with Liam without the silent, watchful presence of my boyfriend. It's a terrible thing to admit, but it's the truth. The house felt lighter when Kyle left. Liam and I ordered a pizza and settled onto the big, oversized sofa. We put on some old indie film that neither of us was really paying attention to, the dialogue just a low hum in the background.
We were having one of those deep conversations, the kind that skirts around the edges of things you're not supposed to say. He was telling me about this girl he'd been seeing out west, about how it fell apart because she didn't understand him, didn't get the creative grind. And I was listening, nodding, feeling this weird thrill that he was confiding in me, that he thought I was the only one who got it. "I missed this," he said, turning to look at me. His voice was quieter, almost a whisper. He wasn't looking at my eyes, he was looking at my mouth. Just being able to talk to someone who gets it. It's like, you're the only real person in my life, Evie, the only one who makes sense. My heart started beating faster, that stupid, traitorous flutter that I should have recognized for the warning sign it was. I wanted to deflect, to make a joke, to say something light to break the tension that was suddenly crackling in the air between us. But the words got stuck in my throat, because a part of me didn't want to break it. A part of me was leaning into it, into the attention and the intensity. He reached out, his hand finding mine on the cushion between us. His fingers were warm, and they interlocked with mine with a familiarity that felt both new and ancient. He moved closer, and his hand came up to my face, pushing a strand of hair behind my ear. My skin was on fire. Every rational thought I had was screaming at me to stop, to back away, to remember the man who was currently at a dinner he didn't even want to go to, the man who loved me and trusted me. But Liam was looking at me like I was a mirage, like he'd been wandering in a desert for years and had finally found water, and it was a powerful thing to be seen like that. So I didn't pull away. I let him lean in. I let his lips meet mine. It was a soft kiss at first, tentative, like we were both testing the waters. But it didn't stay soft for long. It deepened, became hungry and desperate, the culmination of a decade of unspoken things, of inside jokes and shared glances that suddenly meant so much more. I felt like I was drowning, and I didn't want to be saved. We pulled apart, both breathing heavily, staring at each other in the dim light of the television. There was a wild, terrified look in his eyes, but there was also a certainty. He didn't have to say anything. He just pulled me back to him, and this time there was no hesitation. We were careful, acutely aware of the thin walls, of the vulnerability of the situation. It was clumsy and frantic and so utterly charged with emotion that my mind went completely blank. I wasn't thinking of Kyle. I wasn't thinking of the future. I was only thinking of the present, of the feeling of being desired by the man who had always been the what if in the back of my mind.
Afterward, we lay there, tangled together on the couch, my head on his chest. I could feel his heart pounding, the same frantic rhythm as mine. He kissed the top of my head, and a sense of peace washed over me, a false sense of rightness that I desperately wanted to believe in. I told myself it was a mistake, a one-time thing, a slip brought on by wine and nostalgia. But I knew, deep in my gut, even as I was making that promise to myself, that it was a lie. Something fundamental had shifted. I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. We didn't talk about it. We just fell asleep there, curled up on the couch, the movie long over and the screen now displaying a black menu. The sound of a key turning in the lock is what woke me. My eyes flew open, and for a split second I had no idea where I was. The room was dark, illuminated only by the pale orange glow of the streetlights filtering through the blinds. And then I remembered. Panic, cold and sharp, shot through me like a bullet. I scrambled to sit up, pushing Liam's arm off me, my mind racing 1,000,000 miles a minute. The door opened, and there was Kyle. He was silhouetted against the light from the hallway, and he was still wearing his jacket, his keys in his hand. He was early. He wasn't supposed to be home for another hour. I opened my mouth, a pathetic, empty sound coming out, a wordless attempt to explain the inexplicable.
Liam was stirring,
groggy, and the sight of him, half naked and confused on the couch, made my stomach lurch. Kyle didn't scream. He didn't charge. He just stood there, frozen in the doorway, looking at me, then at Liam, and then back at me. The silence was worse than any yelling could have been. It was a void, an empty, echoing chasm where our life had just been. He just shook his head, a slow, disbelieving motion, and I saw the light in his eyes die. It was a physical, visible thing, the shattering of 6 years of love and trust. And in that moment, I knew there was nothing I could say that would ever fix it. Everything I had, everything I had worked for, was gone. And the worst part was, as I watched him retreat back out the door, closing it silently behind him, I didn't even know who I was supposed to be chasing after. The seconds after the door clicked shut felt like hours. I just sat there, naked on the couch with Liam's arms still tangled around my waist, staring at the door like it was a portal to another dimension. Part of me expected Kyle to burst back through, to yell, to throw something, to do anything that would break the suffocating silence that was pressing in on me from all sides. But he didn't. The hallway was quiet. The whole building was quiet. It was just me and the sound of my own ragged breathing and the soft, confused murmur of Liam asking what happened. Who was that? Was that Kyle? The question hung in the air, stupid and pointless, because we both knew exactly who it was. I pulled away from him, my skin crawling with a sudden, violent revulsion. I didn't want him touching me anymore. I didn't want anyone touching me. I grabbed my oversized t-shirt from the floor, the one I'd been wearing earlier, and pulled it over my head, feeling the fabric stick to my damp skin. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get my arms through the sleeves. Liam was sitting up now, trying to find his jeans in the dark, his movements frantic and clumsy. I could hear him swearing under his breath, little whispered curses that were supposed to be reassuring, but just made me feel more alone. I walked to the door like I was walking through quicksand. Every step was a monumental effort. My bare feet were cold against the concrete floor, and I remember noticing that, the small, absurd detail, the coldness of the floor, because my brain was trying to find something, anything, to focus on that wasn't the gaping hole in the center of my chest. I opened the door and looked out into the hallway. It was empty. The elevator at the far end was just closing, and I caught a glimpse of his work jacket, that familiar olive green Carhartt that I'd bought him for his birthday 2 years ago, disappearing behind the steel doors. I wanted to scream his name, to run after him, to fall at his feet and beg him to come back, but the words were trapped somewhere deep in my throat, tangled up with all the shame and regret that was flooding my system. I just stood there, gripping the doorframe, watching the numbers above the elevator tick down. 1, 2, 3, 4. He was going to the lobby. He was going to leave the building. He was going to get in his truck and drive away. And I had no idea where he would go, because his entire life was here, in this apartment, with me. When I finally turned back, Liam was fully dressed and standing in the middle of the living room with this helpless, panicked look on his face. He was running his hands through his hair, messing up the already disheveled strands, and he kept opening his mouth to speak and then closing it again. I didn't have the energy to comfort him. I didn't have the energy to do anything. I just walked past him into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, my hands still trembling so hard that water sloshed over the rim and pooled on the counter. I stared at the puddle, at the way it reflected the dim light from the refrigerator, and I thought about how just a few hours ago I had been laughing, feeling alive and electric, and now everything was gray and dead. Liam came up behind me, his footsteps hesitant. He placed a hand on my shoulder, and I flinched, stepping away from him. The look of hurt on his face was almost comical, like he was the one who had been wronged, like he was the victim of some cruel cosmic joke. He said my name, soft and pleading, and I just shook my head, my jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. "You need to go," I said, and my voice came out flat and foreign, like it belonged to someone else. "You need to pack your stuff, and you need to leave." He started to protest, to say something about how it was late, about how we should talk about this, about how he didn't mean for it to happen. But I cut him off, a harsh, bitter laugh escaping my lips. I didn't mean for it to happen. Neither of us meant for it to happen. That was the most pathetic excuse I'd ever heard. I had meant it. I had wanted it. I had let it happen because I was selfish and stupid, and I'd convinced myself that the rules of my life didn't apply to me. That's what made it so unforgivable. It wasn't an accident. It was a choice, a series of choices, and I had made every single one of them. I told him again, louder this time, my voice cracking on the last word. Leave. Now. He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes searching mine for something, maybe forgiveness, maybe understanding, but all he found was a cold, hard wall. He nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping, and walked back to the living room to gather his things. I watched him shove his clothes into his duffel bags, his guitar case knocking against the coffee table, and I felt nothing. No sadness.
No remorse. Just a vast, hollow emptiness that swallowed up every other emotion. He paused at the door, his hand on the handle, and turned to look at me one last time. He said he was sorry. He said he never wanted to hurt me. And I just stared at him. This man who had been my best friend for over a decade. This man who had made me feel seen and understood in a way I hadn't felt in years. And I realized I didn't know him at all. I didn't know who he was, because the Liam I thought I knew would never have let things go this far. The Liam I thought I knew would have stopped me, would have been the voice of reason, would have said something about Kyle and the life I was risking. But he hadn't. He had leaned into it just as much as I had, maybe more, and that made him a stranger to me. He left, the door closing with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the silent apartment. I was alone, utterly, completely, devastatingly alone. I slid down the wall and sat on the cold concrete floor, my knees pulled up to my chest, and I let the tears come. They weren't pretty, cinematic tears. They were ugly, heaving sobs that shook my entire body, the kind that leave you gasping for air and feeling like your ribs are going to crack. I cried for Kyle, for the life we had built, for the future we had planned, for the way he had looked at me in that doorway, his eyes full of a betrayal so profound it was almost tangible. I cried for myself, for the stupid, naive part of me that thought I could have it all, that thought I could play with fire and not get burned. I don't know how long I sat there. It could have been minutes. It could have been hours. The sky outside the window started to lighten, that pale, sickly gray that precedes the dawn, and I watched it with a kind of numb detachment. The city was waking up. People were getting ready for their Sunday mornings, making coffee, reading the paper, going to brunch. Normal people with normal lives who hadn't just destroyed everything they loved in a single stupid night. My phone was on the kitchen counter, and I knew I should call Kyle. I knew I should text him, beg him to come home, explain that it was a mistake, that I loved him, that he was the only one I wanted. But every time I reached for the phone, I pulled my hand back, because what could I possibly say? Sorry doesn't fix it. I love you doesn't change the fact that I had another man in our home, on our couch, in the space that was supposed to be ours. The betrayal wasn't just the sex, it was the intimacy. It was the way I had looked at Liam, the way I had let him touch me, the way I had given him something that was supposed to be reserved for Kyle and Kyle alone. It was the late nights and the private jokes and the way I had slowly, methodically shut Kyle out of his own life. I had been unfaithful long before that night on the couch. I had been unfaithful the moment I started preferring Liam's company to my boyfriend's, the moment I started hiding behind my phone when Kyle tried to talk to me, the moment I let a decade-old connection become more important than the man sleeping in my bed. I finally forced myself to stand up, my legs stiff and aching from being in the same position for so long. I walked into the bedroom, and it felt like stepping into a crime scene. Kyle's side of the bed was still made, the covers untouched. His pillows still had the indentation from where he'd rested his head the night before. His cologne was on the dresser, a bottle of Tom Ford that I'd bought him for Christmas.
and the scent of it, woody and familiar, hit me like a physical blow. I sank onto the edge of the mattress and picked up his pillow, hugging it to my chest. It smelled like him, like his shampoo and his skin and everything that was safe and good in my life. I buried my face in it and sobbed again, muffling the sound in the fabric. I thought about all the mornings we'd waking up together, the way he'd make coffee and bring it to me in bed, the way he'd kiss my forehead and tell me he loved me. I thought about the little things, the way he'd always leave the last slice of pizza for me, the way he'd hold my hand when we were watching TV, the way he'd look at me across a crowded room and smile like I was the only person in the world. I had taken all of that for granted. I had treated his love like it was a given, like it was an immutable fact of the universe, and I had thrown it away for a moment of passion on a couch with a man who didn't even have a real job. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, and my heart lurched. I scrambled for it, hoping it was Kyle, praying it was Kyle, but it was just a notification from my email, some spam from a clothing store I'd bought from once. I tossed the phone back down, a fresh wave of despair washing over me. I tried to call Kyle. I dialed his number, my thumb shaking so badly I almost hit the wrong button. It went straight to voicemail. I tried again. Voicemail. Again. Voicemail. He had turned off his phone. He had cut me off, completely and utterly, and the finality of that gesture was more devastating than any screaming match could have been. I left a message, a rambling, incoherent mess of apologies and pleas, but I knew he wouldn't listen to it. He wouldn't listen to anything I had to say, because there was nothing I could say that would make this right. I called his best friend, Mark, a guy I'd always gotten along with, hoping maybe Kyle had gone to him. The phone rang, and I was about to hang up when Mark picked up, his voice groggy and confused. "Evie? It's like 6 a.m. What's wrong?" I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The words were stuck again, clogged in my throat by a wall of shame. I managed to choke out, "Is Kyle with you?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and I could hear the gears turning in Mark's head. He was trying to figure out what was going on, trying to decide if he should tell me the truth or protect his friend. Finally, he sighed, a heavy, weary sound, and said, "Yeah, he's here. He showed up a couple hours ago looking like he'd seen a ghost. He wouldn't tell me what happened, but he's asleep on my couch now. He's fine, Evie. He just needs some space." Some space. The phrase was so cliché, so inadequate, that I almost laughed. Space was the least of our problems. Space was a luxury we couldn't afford. Space was just a gentle way of saying he couldn't stand to look at me right now, and I couldn't blame him. I asked Mark if I should come over, if I should try to talk to Kyle, and Mark said no, his voice firm, but not unkind. He said give him a day, let him cool down, and then try again. I thanked him, my voice hollow, and hung up, the phone slipping from my fingers and landing on the bed with a soft thud. Give him a day. As if a day could undo what I had done. As if a day could wash away the image of me tangled up with another man on the couch he'd helped me pick out. I spent the rest of that awful, interminable Sunday in a daze. I didn't eat, I didn't shower. I just wandered around the apartment, touching his things, picking up his coffee mug from the kitchen counter and staring at the dried brown stain at the bottom. I looked at the photos on the bookshelf, pictures of us at the beach, at a wedding, at a stupid New Year's Eve party where we were both wearing those ridiculous hats. I'd looked at our life, preserved in those glossy little squares, and I felt like I was looking at someone else's memories. The girl in those photos was happy. She had no idea what was coming. She had no idea that in just a few short weeks, she would become the villain in her own story. By Monday morning, I was a wreck. I hadn't slept, my eyes were swollen and red, and I looked like I'd aged 10 years. I had to work, but I couldn't focus. I stared at my laptop screen, the blinking cursor mocking me, and I typed and deleted the same sentence over and over again. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart would leap into my throat, but it was never him. It was clients, colleagues, the mundane noise of a world that was still spinning, while mine had ground to a halt. I called Kyle again, and again it went straight to voicemail. I left another message, shorter this time, just a plea for him to call me back, to let me explain, to give me a chance.
But deep down, I knew there was no chance. Some things can't be fixed. Some cracks are too deep, too wide, and they just splinter everything apart until there's nothing left but jagged pieces. I started thinking about the logistics of it all, the horrible, practical details of a breakup. Who would keep the apartment? Who would get the furniture? We'd bought the couch together, that stupid, beautiful couch that was now a monument to my betrayal. I couldn't look at it without seeing Liam's face, without feeling the weight of his body on mine. I would have to get rid of it. I would have to get rid of everything that reminded me of what I'd done. I spent the next few days in a fog of misery and self-loathing. I barely left the apartment. I ordered groceries online and ate whatever was easiest, cold cereal and stale bread, things that didn't require any effort. I stopped answering calls from friends. I ignored my sister's texts. I couldn't face anyone because I knew they would see it on my face, the guilt and the shame and the awful, consuming regret. I was a ghost in my own life, haunting the spaces I'd once filled with laughter and love. And then, on Wednesday, I got a text from Kyle. It was just a short message, cold and clinical, saying he was coming over to get his things. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely type out a response. I told him I would be there, that I wanted to talk. And he just said, okay. That was it. One word. A lifetime of love reduced to a single, emotionless syllable. When he walked through the door that evening, it felt like I was seeing a stranger. He looked terrible. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face was pale, and there was a gauntness to his cheeks that hadn't been there a week ago. He wasn't wearing his usual work clothes. He was in jeans and a plain t-shirt, and he looked smaller somehow, diminished. He wouldn't look at me. He just walked past me, his gaze fixed on the floor, and went into the bedroom to start packing his clothes. I followed him, standing in the doorway, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. I started talking, the words spilling out of me in a desperate, jumbled rush. I told him I was sorry, that I was so sorry, that it didn't mean anything, that I loved him, that I had made a terrible mistake. I told him I would do anything to fix it, that I would go to therapy, that I would never speak to Liam again, that I would spend the rest of my life making it up to him. I promised him everything, anything, just to get him to look at me. But he didn't. He just kept packing, his movements methodical and robotic, folding his shirts with a precision that was almost painful to watch. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet I almost didn't hear it. He said he couldn't do this, that he couldn't have this conversation, that he didn't want to hear my excuses. He said he'd seen what he'd seen, and that was all he needed to know. I kept pleading, kept crying, my voice rising to a near hysterical pitch. I grabbed his arm, trying to make him look at me, and he flinched, pulling away like my touch was poison. That's when something inside me broke. The grief that had been simmering in my chest boiled over into something else, something darker and more desperate. I started yelling, accusing him of not fighting for us, of giving up too easily, of not loving me enough to try and work through it. It was ugly, pathetic, the desperate flailing of a drowning person trying to drag someone else down with them. I told him he was being cruel, that he was punishing me, that he didn't understand. And then I said the worst thing, the thing I can never take back. I told him that maybe he should have been there that night, that maybe if he hadn't left me alone with Liam, none of it would have happened. The words hung in the air between us, ugly and twisted, and I watched the last shred of kindness drain from Kyle's face. He looked at me then, really looked at me, his eyes hard and full of a cold, icy fury. He said that was the most pathetic thing he'd ever heard. He said I was a grown woman, that I made my own choices, and that I didn't get to blame him for my betrayal. He said he had loved me, truly loved me, and I had taken that love and ground it into the dirt. He finished packing, zipped up his duffel bag, and walked past me without another word. I followed him to the door, still crying, still begging, but he was gone. He walked out of the apartment and out of my life, and I was left standing in the hallway, alone, with nothing but the echo of my own terrible words ringing in my ears. I had blamed him.
I had blamed the man I'd betrayed for my own infidelity. That was the moment I knew I had lost him forever.
Not when he'd walked in and seen me with Liam, but in that moment when I tried to shift the blame and avoid the truth. I'd shown him that I wasn't just unfaithful, but I was weak, cruel, and unwilling to take responsibility for my actions. That was the real betrayal, and it was unforgivable. The weeks that followed Kyle's departure were a blur of gray, shapeless days that bled into one another like watercolors left out in the rain. I existed in a state of suspended animation, going through the motions of living without actually being alive. I'd wake up in the morning, reach across the bed for a body that wasn't there, and feel the cold, empty space where Kyle used to sleep like a physical wound. The apartment that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a mausoleum, every corner haunted by the ghost of our shared life. I'd find his hair tie on the nightstand, a single strand of his dark hair still wrapped around it, and I'd hold it in my palm like a relic, like a piece of a person I'd killed. I stopped going to the office. I worked from home, hunched over my laptop in the same pair of sweatpants for days on end, letting my inbox pile up with unread messages I couldn't bring myself to care about. My clients started to notice, sending passive-aggressive emails about deadlines and deliverables, but I couldn't muster the energy to care. Everything felt pointless, hollow, a performance I was putting on for an audience that had already left the theater. I became obsessed with Kyle, not in a romantic way, not anymore, but in a way that felt like picking at a scab, desperate to feel something other than the crushing numbness that had settled over me. I checked his social media obsessively, scrolling through his Instagram feed, looking for clues about his life without me. He hadn't posted anything, but that didn't stop me from refreshing his page a dozen times a day, hoping for some sign that he was struggling as much as I was. I'd drive past his favorite coffee shop, the one we used to go to on Saturday mornings, and I'd park across the street and just watch the door, waiting for him to walk out. I never saw him. It was like he'd vanished, like he'd been erased from the city we'd built together. I called his mother once, a desperate, pathetic attempt to get information. She was a kind woman, a retired school teacher who had always treated me like a daughter, and I could hear the disappointment in her voice when she answered the phone. She told me Kyle was staying with a friend, that he was doing okay, that he didn't want to talk to me. She said it gently, but the words landed like a slap. She told me I needed to move on, that I needed to give him space, and then she hung up, and I was left holding a dead phone in my hands, feeling more alone than ever. It was in this state of emotional ruin that I started drinking. Not the casual glass of wine with dinner, but the kind of drinking that starts in the afternoon and doesn't stop until I pass out on the couch. I'd pour myself a gin and tonic at noon, telling myself it was to take the edge off, and by 3 in the afternoon, I'd be refilling my glass with straight vodka, the tonic long forgotten. I'd drink until my thoughts stopped racing, until the images of Kyle's face in the doorway, of Liam's hands on my skin, blurred and faded into a fuzzy and distinct haze. It was a temporary reprieve, a few hours of blessed oblivion before the guilt came crashing back down on me in the middle of the night, leaving me shaking and nauseous and full of a self-loathing so profound it felt like it was going to consume me whole. My friends started to notice. My sister Jenna called me one afternoon and told me I sounded drunk, and I lied and said I had a cold. She didn't believe me. She said she was coming over, and I told her not to, my voice too sharp, too defensive. She said she was worried about me, that I was pushing everyone away, and I just hung up on her. I didn't want to see anyone. I didn't want to be seen. I wanted to wallow in my misery, to punish myself with my own company, because I deserved it. I deserved every second of the pain I was feeling. I had earned it. And then, about a month after the breakup, Liam reached out. It was a text, just a simple 3-word message that appeared on my phone screen like a ghost from a grave I'd tried to bury. How are you? I stared at the words for a long time, my thumb hovering over the keyboard, my heart pounding with a familiar, treacherous rhythm. A part of me wanted to ignore it, to delete it and pretend I'd never seen it. He was the source of all my misery, the catalyst for the destruction of my entire life. But another part of me, a darker, more desperate part, felt a flicker of something that wasn't pain. It was attention. It was the validation I'd been craving, the knowledge that someone, somewhere, was thinking about me. I didn't respond right away. I left him on red for 2 days, a petty, passive-aggressive punishment that made me feel momentarily powerful. But on the 3rd day, when the loneliness became unbearable and the walls of my apartment started to close in on me, I wrote back. I kept it short and cold, just a single word. Fine. He responded almost immediately, like he'd been waiting by his phone. He said he was sorry. He said he'd been thinking about me, about that night, about everything. He said he knew I probably hated him, but he had to talk to me, to make sure I was okay. And I believed him. I wanted to believe him, because believing him meant I wasn't completely alone. It meant there was still someone in the world who cared about me, even if that someone was the man who'd helped me burn my life to the ground. We started talking again, tentatively at first, then more frequently. He'd text me in the evenings, asking about my day, sending me funny memes, talking about the projects he was working on. It was so easy to fall back into our old rhythm, to let the familiarity of his voice soothe the jagged edges of my grief. I knew it was wrong. I knew I was using him as a crutch, a Band-Aid on a wound that required major surgery. But I didn't care. I was drowning, and he was a lifeline, and I was too weak to let go. We met up for coffee a few weeks later, at a small, out-of-the-way cafe on the other side of town, where I was sure I wouldn't run into anyone I knew. He looked the same. Still handsome and disheveled, with that same charming smile that had always made me weak in the knees. He hugged me when I walked in, and the feel of his arms around me was both familiar and foreign. I'd forgotten how tall he was, how his chest felt against mine. We sat down, and he ordered me a latte without asking, the way he used to, and it made me feel a flutter of something I hadn't felt in weeks. We talked for hours, circling around the elephant in the room, avoiding the subject of Kyle and that night, and everything that had happened. But eventually, the conversation turned, like it always did. He told me he felt terrible, that he'd never meant to hurt me, that he'd been in love with me for years and had just never had the courage to say it. He said he'd come back east specifically to see me, that he'd convinced himself that if he could just get me alone, he could make me see what we could be. He said he knew it was selfish, knew it was wrong, but he couldn't help it. He said he thought about me all the time, that he couldn't get me out of his head. The confession was intoxicating. It was everything I'd wanted to hear, everything I'd been desperate for in the dark, lonely nights after Kyle left. I was so starved for affection, for someone to tell me I was wanted, that I latched onto his words like a drowning person clinging to a piece of driftwood. I told him I didn't blame him. I told him it was my fault, that I had made the choice, that I had wanted it too. I told him I missed him, that I missed talking to him, that he was the only person who understood me. And when he reached across the table and took my hand, I let him. I let him pull me in, and I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new, something that would make up for all the pain I'd caused. We started seeing each other in secret. It was a clandestine affair, filled with stolen moments and guilty glances. We'd meet for late-night walks along the river, holding hands and talking about our dreams, our fears, our regrets. We'd go to dive bars in parts of the city where no one knew us, drinking cheap beer and laughing at nothing, pretending we were two normal people falling in love. He'd come over to my apartment, and we'd order takeout and watch movies on the couch, the very same couch where everything had fallen apart. I told myself I hated that couch, that I wanted to burn it. But now it felt different. It felt like a symbol of rebirth, of second chances. We were careful, always careful, terrified of being seen by anyone who might know Kyle, anyone who might whisper about the woman who had destroyed her relationship for another man. But the secrecy was part of the thrill. It made everything feel more intense, more dangerous, more real. I was in a fantasy, a bubble of my own making, and I refused to let reality burst it. But reality has a way of intruding, no matter how hard you try to keep it out. It happened at a friend's engagement party, a lavish affair at a rooftop bar downtown. I had almost said no, but my sister had practically forced me, telling me I couldn't hide forever, that I needed to get out of the house and see people. I went alone, feeling like a fraud in a pretty dress, plastering a fake smile on my face as I made the rounds, hugging people I hadn't seen in months,
deflecting their questions about Kyle with vague, non-committal answers. The party was in full swing, music thumping, champagne flowing, and I was actually starting to relax, to feel almost normal, when I saw him. Kyle. He was standing across the room, talking to the groom, a whiskey in his hand, looking tan and fit and devastatingly handsome. He was wearing a navy suit I'd never seen before, and he looked like he'd moved on, like he was thriving, like he'd shed the weight of our relationship and come out stronger on the other side. My heart stopped. My lungs seized. I couldn't breathe. I stood frozen in the middle of the crowd, a champagne flute in my hand, staring at the man I'd destroyed, and I felt the world tilt on its axis. He didn't see me at first, and I had a split second to decide what to do. I could run, slip out the back door before he noticed, avoid the confrontation I knew would shatter the fragile peace I'd built. Or I could stay, face him, try to make amends. I was still paralyzed, caught between fight and flight, when he looked up and our eyes met. The moment stretched into an eternity, a painful, silent recognition that passed between us across the crowded room. I saw the flash of surprise in his eyes, the brief flicker of pain that was quickly masked by a mask of cold indifference. He looked away, turning back to the groom, and I felt a physical ache in my chest, a phantom pain where his love used to be. I couldn't stay. I couldn't breathe. I set down my champagne glass and made a beeline for the exit, pushing through the crowd of laughing, oblivious partygoers. I was almost to the door when I felt a hand on my arm. I spun around, my heart in my throat, expecting to see Kyle. But it was Mark, his best friend, the man who had been kind enough to answer my call that horrible morning.
He looked at me, his face a mixture of pity and anger, and he shook his head slowly. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and tight. "He didn't know you were going to be here. I didn't tell him. I didn't want to make this harder for him." I could feel the tears prickling at my eyes, the shame burning hot in my cheeks. I stammered an apology, telling him I didn't know, that I would leave, that I was sorry. He just stared at me, this man who had been a friend to both of us, and I saw the judgment in his eyes. He told me to stay away from Kyle, to let him heal, to stop making everything about me. He said it with such cold fury that I flinched, feeling the truth of his words like a slap. He was right. I was making it about me. I was the villain of this story, and I was pretending to be the victim. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and fled the party, stumbling down the stairs and out onto the street. I got in my car and just sat there, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my whole body trembling. I had seen him. I had seen the man I'd loved, the man I'd betrayed, and he was fine. He was more than fine. He was moving on. And I was stuck, trapped in a purgatory of my own making, clinging to a fantasy that was never going to come true. That night, I went home and found Liam waiting for me in the parking lot of my building. He had a bottle of wine in his hand, and he smiled when he saw me, that easy, charming smile that had once made me feel so alive. But tonight, it just made me feel sick. I told him what happened, the words spilling out of me in a jumbled rush, and I waited for him to comfort me, to tell me it was okay, to make me feel better. But he didn't. He just listened, his face unreadable. And when I was done, he said something that made my blood run cold. He asked me if I still loved Kyle. The question hung in the air between us, heavy and accusatory. I opened my mouth to say no, to tell him that I was with him now, that Kyle was in the past. But the words wouldn't come. Because the truth was, I didn't know. I didn't know what I felt anymore. I was so confused, so tangled up in guilt and regret and this desperate need for validation that I couldn't separate my feelings for Liam from my need to fill the void that Kyle had left behind. I realized in that moment that I had been using Liam. I had been using him as a replacement, a stand-in for the love I had lost, and I had never really stopped loving Kyle. I had just been too afraid to admit it. Liam saw the hesitation on my face, the doubt in my eyes, and his expression hardened. He set the wine bottle down on the hood of my car and took a step back from me, his jaw clenched. He said he couldn't do this anymore. He said he'd been patient, he'd been understanding, he'd given me space to grieve, but he couldn't compete with a ghost. He said he loved me,
that he'd always loved me, but he couldn't be with someone who was still in love with another man.
I started to protest, to tell him he was wrong, but he cut me off, his voice sharp and bitter. He said he saw the way I looked at Kyle tonight, even from a distance. He said he saw the pain in my eyes, the longing, and he knew, right then and there, that he would never be enough. He told me I needed to figure out what I wanted, who I wanted, and until I did, he was done. He walked away, leaving me standing in the cold parking lot, the unopened bottle of wine on the hood of my car, and the taste of my own bitter mistakes in my mouth. I had lost him too. I had lost them both, and I had no one to blame but myself. I spent the next 3 days in a state of paralysis, barely eating, barely sleeping, just lying on my bed and staring at the ceiling, replaying every mistake I'd ever made on an endless loop in my head. The silence in my apartment was deafening, the kind of silence that makes you hear your own heartbeat and wonder if it's going to stop. I had pushed everyone away. I had lost Kyle, lost Liam, lost my friends, lost my sister's trust. I had become a cautionary tale, the woman who had everything and threw it all away for a fleeting moment of passion. I couldn't even look at myself in the mirror anymore. The face that stared back at me was a stranger's, hollow-eyed and gaunt, a face that belonged to someone I didn't want to know. I thought about calling Kyle again. I even dialed his number, my thumb hovering over the call button, but I couldn't bring myself to press it.
What would I say? What could I possibly say that I hadn't already said 100 times before? I had apologized until the words lost all meaning, and it hadn't changed anything. I had begged and pleaded and made promises I couldn't keep, and it hadn't mattered. He had moved on. He was healing, and I was still here, stuck in the wreckage of my own making, refusing to let go of a past that no longer existed. It was my sister, Jenna, who finally broke through the wall I'd built around myself. She showed up at my apartment on a Thursday afternoon, letting herself in with the spare key I'd forgotten she had. I was on the couch, still in my pajamas, a half-empty bottle of vodka on the coffee table, and I looked like I hadn't seen the sun in a month. She took one look at me and her face crumpled, not with anger, but with a profound, heartbreaking sadness. She sat down next to me, took the bottle out of my hand, and poured it down the kitchen sink. Then she came back, sat down, and took my hands in hers. She didn't yell. She didn't lecture. She just held my hands and waited. And I broke. The dam I'd been holding back for months finally burst, and I sobbed into her shoulder, ugly, gasping sobs that racked my entire body. I told her everything: the affair, the betrayal, the guilt, the shame, the desperate, pathetic way I tried to fill the void with Liam. I told her about seeing Kyle at the party, about the way he'd looked at me like I was a stranger, about the way Mark had told me to stay away. I told her about Liam walking away, about how I'd used him and pushed him aside, and how I was now completely, utterly alone. She listened to all of it, her hands never leaving mine, and when I was done, she said the thing I needed to hear most. She said I had made a terrible mistake, a series of terrible mistakes, but I wasn't a monster. She said I was a human being, flawed and broken and capable of cruelty, but also capable of growth. She said the first step to fixing anything was to stop running from the truth, to stop numbing the pain with alcohol and self-pity, and to actually face what I had done. She told me to get off the couch, take a shower, and start acting like someone who wanted to be alive. And I realized in that moment that she was right. I had been wallowing in my own misery because it was easier than taking responsibility. It was easier to hate myself than it was to do the hard work of becoming a better person. I had been using my guilt as a shield, a way of avoiding the real work of atonement. I had been so busy punishing myself that I hadn't actually done anything to make amends. I had apologized, sure, but apologies without action are just empty words. They're a way of making yourself feel better without actually changing anything. That was the turning point. The moment I decided I was done feeling sorry for myself, the moment I decided I was going to become the kind of person who deserved to be happy, even if it took the rest of my life. I took Jenna's advice. I showered,
put on real clothes, and went out into the world. I started therapy, a decision I had been avoiding for months because I was too proud to admit I needed help. My therapist, a no-nonsense woman named Dr. Patel, didn't let me get away with anything. She made me confront the uncomfortable truths I had been hiding from, the deep-seated insecurities and fears that had driven me to sabotage my own happiness. She helped me understand that my affair wasn't just about Liam, wasn't just about a moment of weakness. It was about a pattern of behavior, a need for external validation, a fear of intimacy and commitment that I had been carrying around my whole life. I started journaling, writing down my thoughts and feelings in a messy, unedited stream of consciousness. I started going to yoga, not for the spiritual stuff, but just to get out of my head and into my body, to feel the stretch of my muscles and the burn in my lungs. I started reaching out to friends I had pushed away, sending them heartfelt messages of apology, telling them I was working on myself and I hoped they could give me a second chance. Some of them forgave me, some of them didn't, but I had to accept that, to understand that I couldn't control how other people felt, only how I behaved. The hardest part was letting go of Kyle, not of my love for him, but of the hope that we would ever get back together. I had been clinging to that hope like a lifeline, a fantasy that was preventing me from moving forward. I still loved him. I think a part of me will always love him, but I had to accept that I had lost the right to be with him. I had broken his trust in the most profound way possible, and some things can't be fixed. It took weeks of therapy, of painful, honest self-reflection to reach that point. I had to sit with the reality that Kyle was gone, that he was probably happier without me, that he deserved to be with someone who would never, ever hurt him the way I had. I had to grieve the relationship, not just the breakup, but the loss of the person I used to be, the person who was capable of such casual cruelty. I cried a lot. I cried in therapy, I cried in my car, I cried in the grocery store when I saw a brand of coffee we used to drink together. But slowly, painfully, the tears started to come less frequently. The raw, gaping wound in my chest started to heal, leaving behind a scar that I would carry with me forever, a reminder of the worst thing I'd ever done. I stopped drinking. It was hard, harder than I'd expected, because I had been using alcohol as a crutch for so long. I had to learn how to sit with my feelings, how to experience the full weight of my guilt and shame without numbing them. It was terrifying at first, to feel everything so acutely, but it was also liberating. I started to feel like myself again, a different version of myself, a version that was more honest, more self-aware, more capable of empathy. I started writing again, not for work, but for myself. I wrote about everything, the affair, the guilt, the shame, the slow, painful process of rebuilding my life. It was cathartic, a way of exorcising the demons that had been haunting me. I also started volunteering at a local animal shelter, a small thing, but it helped me feel like I was contributing to something good, like I was putting some positivity back into the world after all the negativity I'd caused. There was a scrappy little pit bull mix named Duke who had been abandoned by his owner, and I fell in love with him. He was a mess, all scars and nervous energy, but there was something in his eyes, a resilience, a will to trust again despite everything he'd been through. I adopted him. It was impulsive and maybe a little ridiculous, but bringing him home was the best decision I'd made in a long time. He slept on my bed, snuggled up against me, and his warmth filled some of the cold, empty spaces in my heart. A few months passed, and I started to feel like I was ready to face Kyle. Not to win him back, but to apologize properly, without the desperation and the excuses. I had written him a letter, pages and pages of it, trying to articulate everything I felt, everything I had learned, everything I was sorry for. I read it to my therapist, and she helped me edit it, cutting out the self-pity and the justifications, leaving only the raw, honest truth. I wanted him to know that I wasn't writing to him to get anything from him, that I didn't expect his forgiveness, that I just wanted him to know that I understood the depth of my betrayal and that I was genuinely, profoundly sorry. I wanted him to know that I had changed, that I was working on myself, and that I would never, ever do anything like that to anyone again. I mailed the letter,
a physical letter with a stamp and everything, because it felt more real, more tangible than an email or a text. I didn't expect a response. I told myself I was okay with that the act of writing it and sending it was enough. But a part of me, that stubborn, hopeful part that refused to die, still wished for one. I didn't hear back from him for weeks. I told myself to let it go, to move on, to accept that he wasn't ready to hear from me, that maybe he never would be. I threw myself into my work, my therapy, my dog, my writing. I started to build a new life, a quieter life, a life that was more about integrity and less about performance. I started going on casual dates, nothing serious, just getting coffee with people who didn't know my history, who only knew the woman I was becoming. It was awkward and strange, but it was also a sign of progress, a sign that I was ready to move forward. And then, one evening, I came home from a long walk with Duke to find an envelope sitting in my mailbox. It was addressed in handwriting I recognized, Kyle's handwriting, that messy, looping scrawl that I had memorized years ago. My heart stopped. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely open it. I sat down on the stoop of my building, Duke's head resting on my knee, and I read the letter. It was short, much shorter than mine, but it was everything I needed. He said he had read my letter, that he had read it several times, and that he appreciated what I had said. He said he had thought about responding for a long time, that he had written and deleted a dozen different responses. He said he had been angry, so angry, and that it had taken him a long time to let go of that anger. But he said he was tired of holding on to it. He said he didn't forgive me, not completely, not yet, but he understood that I was trying to be a better person, and that meant something to him. He said he hoped I found what I was looking for, that I found peace and happiness, and that I deserved to have a good life. He didn't say he loved me. He didn't say he wanted to see me. But he said he didn't hate me anymore, and that was more than I could have ever hoped for. I sat on that stoop and cried, not tears of sadness, but tears of relief, of release, of a forgiveness I hadn't realized I had been craving. It wasn't a reconciliation. It wasn't a second chance. It was a goodbye, a real, honest, closure-filled goodbye. I read the letter over and over again, letting the words sink in. I realized, in that moment, that I had finally let him go. Not just the idea of him, but the guilt, the shame, the desperate hope that had been holding me back. I had made my peace with the past, and I was ready to embrace the future. I had spent so long defining myself by my worst mistake, letting it overshadow everything good about me, letting it become the only story I could tell. But I was more than that. I was more than the woman who cheated on her boyfriend. I was a person who had the capacity for incredible love and incredible cruelty, and I had chosen to learn from my cruelty rather than be consumed by it. I had chosen to grow. I had chosen to forgive myself, not because I deserved it, but because I couldn't spend the rest of my life paying for a mistake I had already made amends for. I looked down at Duke, his soulful eyes staring up at me, his tail thumping against the concrete, and I smiled. It was a small smile, a tentative smile, but it was real. It was the first real smile I had felt in over a year. My life now is not the life I imagined. It's smaller, quieter, more ordinary. I live in a different apartment now, a one-bedroom place with a tiny balcony where Duke and I sit and watch the sunset over the city. I have a new job, a new routine, a new group of friends who know nothing about my past, only who I am today. I still think about Kyle sometimes, especially on the days when the weather is just right, or when I hear a song we used to love. But it doesn't hurt the way it used to. It's a fond sadness, the kind you feel when you remember a chapter of your life that's over, a chapter that taught you something you needed to learn. I don't know if I'll ever find love again, real love, the kind that lasts. I don't know if I deserve it. But I know that I'm not the same person I was, and I know that I'm capable of being the kind of partner I should have been all those years ago. I know that I have the capacity for honesty, for loyalty, for a love that isn't selfish or destructive. I'm still flawed. I'm still a work in progress, but I'm not broken anymore. I'm not hiding. I think about Liam too, less frequently now. I don't hate him. I don't blame him. He was a symptom of a disease I was already carrying, not the cause. I heard through the grapevine that he moved to New York, that he's working on a documentary about something, I don't remember what. I hope he's happy. I hope he found someone who can love him the way he deserves, without all the baggage and the secrets. But I don't reach out. I don't check his social media. That chapter is closed, and I finally learned to stop reopening old wounds just to see if they still hurt. The past is a fixed point, immovable and unchangeable, and all I can do is learn from it and move forward. I write now, still. It's my outlet, my way of processing the world. I've started a blog, an anonymous one, where I write about healing and second chances and the messy, complicated process of becoming a better person. I don't know if anyone reads it, and I don't really care. It's for me. It's a way of keeping myself honest, of making sure I never forget the lessons I've learned. There are nights when I wake up in a cold sweat, the ghost of my old life haunting my dreams. I dream about the look in Kyle's eyes when he walked in that door, about the cold, hard fury in his voice when he told me it was over. I dream about the way Liam looked at me in the parking lot, his face a mask of disappointment. I dream about the girl I used to be, the selfish, careless girl who thought she could have everything without paying the price. I wake up gasping, my heart pounding, and I reach for Duke, his warm body a grounding presence in the dark. I hold on to him, and I breathe, and I remind myself that I'm not that girl anymore. I've done the work. I've paid the price. I've sat with the shame and the guilt and the regret, and I've come out the other side. It's not a linear process, this healing thing. It's messy and it's slow, and there are days when it feels like I'm back at square one, but those days are getting fewer and farther between. I'm getting better at forgiving myself, at letting go of the things I can't change, at embracing the person I'm trying to become. I've stopped defining myself by my worst mistake. I've stopped letting it be the first thing I think about when I wake up and the last thing I think about before I fall asleep. It's still there, a scar on my heart, a permanent reminder of the damage I'm capable of. But it's not the only thing about me anymore. I have hobbies, I have friends, I have a dog who loves me unconditionally. I have a quiet, peaceful life that I've built with my own two hands, brick by brick, from the ashes of the life I destroyed. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know if I'll ever get married, have kids, settle down in the suburbs with a white picket fence. I don't know if I'll ever find the kind of love that lasts, the kind of love that weathers storms and grows stronger with time. But I know that I'm ready for it. I know that I'm capable of it. I know that if another chance comes my way, I won't squander it. I'll hold on to it with both hands, and I'll never, ever let it go. Because I've learned, through all this pain and heartbreak, that love isn't a guarantee. It's a choice. It's a commitment you make every single day, even on the days when it's hard, even on the days when you're tired and stressed and tempted to take the easy way out. I made the wrong choice once, and it cost me everything. I'll never make that choice again. The story I've told you, it's not a story about redemption or forgiveness. It's a story about consequences. It's a story about the price you pay for your mistakes and the long, hard road you have to walk to become a person who can live with them. I'm not proud of who I was. I'm not even proud of who I am yet, because I know I still have so much more work to do. But I'm no longer ashamed. I'm no longer hiding. I'm no longer letting the worst thing I've ever done define the rest of my life. I've made peace with my past, and I've made peace with the people I've hurt, even if that peace is just a quiet acceptance that will never be the same. I've made peace with myself, with the flawed, complicated, deeply human person I see in the mirror every morning. And that, more than anything else, is what makes me believe that I can find happiness again. I've had to rebuild my life from nothing, piece by piece, and I've done it with a clarity and a purpose I never had before. I don't know what comes next, but for the first time in a long time, I'm not afraid of it. I'm ready. I'm open. I'm living. Finally, in the light. It was a beautiful outdoor ceremony, all twinkling lights and wildflowers, and I was standing at the bar when I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned around, and there he was, holding a glass of champagne, looking at me with a soft, almost gentle expression. We talked for a few minutes, two strangers who used to know each other intimately. He told me he was seeing someone, a woman he'd met at work, and he looked happy. He looked peaceful, and I was happy for him. I really was. I told him I was dating too, casually, that I was taking it slow, and he nodded like he understood. He said he was glad I was doing okay, that he heard from my sister that I was doing better. I told him I was, that I'd finally learned to forgive myself, and he smiled, a real smile, the kind I hadn't seen in years. He didn't say he forgave me, but he didn't have to. I could see it in his eyes, the acceptance, the closure. We hugged, a quick, awkward embrace, and then he went back to his date, and I went back to my life. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was just two people moving on, letting go. And that, I've come to realize, is the most beautiful ending I could have ever hoped for.
সাগরের ঢেউ দেখিয়া নাই মন সাগরে নানা মিলে সাধন ভজন সকলি যাই বিফলে গো সকলি যাই বিফলে ওরে রূপ সাগরের ঢেউ দেখিয়া নাই মন সাগরে নানা মিলে সাধন ভজন সকলি যাই বিফলে গো সকলি যাই বিফলে আহা সাগরের দুই মোহনা একটি আশা একটি যাওয়া সাধক যারা নাই মোতারা সাধক যাহারা নাই মোতারা সাধক যারা নাই মোতারা সাধক সারা যাই ডুবে রূপসাগরে ডুব দিও না সাঁতার না জানলে মনে রূপসাগরে ডুব দিও না সাঁতার না জানলে সাগরের খাইছ ননি আসিয়া এই ববেতে ওরে আরেক সাগরটাকে তোমায় নিতে তার মোহনাতে গো নিতে তার মোহনাতে ও এক সাগরের খাইছ ননি আসিয়া এই ববেতে আরেক সাগরটাকে তোমায় নিতে তার মোহনাতে গো নিতে তার মোহনাতে ওরে মোহনাতে জুয়ার বাটা মোহনাতে জুয়ার বাটা না জানিয়া যাব দিলে মন মরবি কালে রূপসাগরে ডুব দিও না সাঁতার না জানলে মনে রূপসাগরে ডুব দিও না সাঁতার না জানলে সাগরের সাধক যারা তারা নাইমা সাগরে আরে এক চুমুকে শুকাই পানি ডুবার বয়তার না থাকে গো ডুবার বয়তার না থাকে ওরে রূপসাগরের সাধক যারা তারা নাইমা সাগরে এক চুমুকে শুকাই পানি ডুবার বয়তার না থাকে গো ডুবার বয়তার না থাকে ওরে জয় বেবে কয় সাধক সারা জয় বেবে কয় সাধক সারা জয় ভেবে কয় সাধক সারা জুয়ার আসলে যাই ডুবে রূপসাগরে ডুব দিও না সাঁতার না জানলে মনে রূপসাগরে ডুব দিও না সাঁতার না জানলে রূপসাগরে ডুব দিও না সাঁতার না জানলে রূপসাগরে ডুব দিও না সাঁতার না জানলে